This 1870 portrait of a mother and son seems gentle until you notice the boy's hair. At first look, it feels like a lovely image. A woman in silk, a child resting against her shoulder, the soft blur of a studio background behind them. It looks like love. For more than 150 years, it was seen as love, until one archivist could not stop staring at the top of the boy's head. Eleanor Vance had been cataloging photographs at a historical society in Richmond for 11 years. She had worked with thousands of images from the antebellum and Reconstruction eras. She had handled everything from daguerreotypes of Confederate officers to cabinet cards of newly freed families standing stiff and proud outside the first homes they owned. She knew what photographs from this time usually showed. She knew the poses, the props, and the careful staging meant to signal status and respectability. But the image she pulled from a donated estate collection in the spring of 2019 made her stop in a way nothing had for years. The photograph was a cabinet card, about 4 by 6 inches, mounted on thick cardstock, with the photographer's name pressed in gold script along the bottom edge. The woman in the portrait appeared to be in her early 30s, wearing a dark silk dress with jet buttons running from collar to waist. Her hair was parted in the middle and pulled back in a style common in the early 1870s. She sat in a carved wooden chair, and her left arm wrapped around a young boy standing beside her, leaning into the curve of her body. The boy looked to be 6 or 7 years old. His clothes were fine, a small velvet suit with a white lace collar, the kind of outfit a wealthy family might choose for a beloved child on a special day. His skin was brown. His features suggested African ancestry, and his head tilted slightly toward the woman's shoulder in what first appeared to be a natural sign of affection. Eleanor had seen images like this before. Mixed-race families had existed throughout American history, even when laws and customs made it dangerous to acknowledge them openly. She assumed this might be one of those photographs, a quiet record of a relationship that could not be spoken aloud at the time. But something about the boy's hair kept drawing her back. It was straight, not loosely curled or wavy as might naturally appear in a child of mixed heritage. It was straight and flat, almost pressed to his scalp in a way that looked uncomfortable. Along the hairline, just above his left ear, Eleanor noticed a faint discoloration, possibly a chemical burn, or the trace of something worse. She leaned closer, adjusted the angle of her magnifying lamp, and felt her stomach tighten. The hair did not look like it had grown that way. It looked forced. Eleanor Vance had spent more than a decade learning to read photographs the way others read books. She understood that every detail in a 19th century studio portrait was chosen on purpose. The backdrops, the furniture, the placement of hands and bodies, all of it was arranged to send a clear message to the viewer. Wealth, morality, family harmony, respectability, nothing was random. So when something in an image did not fit the expected pattern, it usually meant there was a story the photograph was hiding. She had seen portraits where the wrong detail was a pair of shackles partly hidden behind a chair leg. She had seen images where a so-called loyal servant stood behind a white family, positioned just so, revealing on closer look the iron collar around their neck. She had trained herself to look for what did not belong, the objects and poses that broke the smooth performance of normal life. But she had never seen anything quite like this boy's hair. She removed the cabinet card from its protective sleeve and turned it over. On the back, written in faded pencil, was a name and a date. Adelaide Marsh with son, 1870. Below that, in a different hand, was a single word that had been partly erased, but was still readable if held at the right angle. The word was Samuel. 2 names, mother and son, according to the note. But the attempt to erase Samuel's name suggested that someone, at some point, wanted to undo whatever claim this photograph made about their connection. Eleanor placed the card on her desk and stared at it for a long time. She had a feeling, one she had learned to trust, that this was not simply a portrait of a mother and her child. It was proof of something else, and if she did not follow it, whatever truth lay here would remain hidden. The photographer's stamp on the card read Whitmore and Company, Richmond. Eleanor started there, pulling city directories from the 1860s and 1870s to trace the studio's past. She found it listed on Broad Street from 1858 to 1879, run by a man named Thomas Whitmore, who advertised portraits of distinction for families of quality. The wording was common for the time, meant to signal that the studio served wealthy white clients. But a deeper search into Whitmore's business records, donated to a university archive in the 1990s, revealed something more troubling. Whitmore had kept a separate ledger for what he called special commissions. These were portraits taken for clients who did not want their names written in the main appointment book. The entries were brief, listing only initials, dates, and short notes about payment. One entry dated March 1870 caught Eleanor's eye. It read, "A.M. portrait with Ward, hair preparation required, extra fee. Ward not son and hair preparation." Eleanor felt the pieces begin to come together, though the picture forming was deeply unsettling. She contacted a colleague at a university in Washington, a historian named Dr. Lorraine Okonkwo, who studied the post-emancipation period and the legal ways white families kept control over black children after slavery officially ended. Dr. Okonkwo had spent years documenting the system of apprenticing black children to their former enslavers, a practice that allowed white families to keep black minors as unpaid labor under the excuse of training and care. She had also written about companion children, black children kept in white households not for work, but for display, dressed well and presented as proof of the family's kindness. When Eleanor sent her a high-resolution scan of the photograph, Dr. Okonkwo replied within hours. She wrote that she had seen images like this before. The clothing, the pose, the closeness to the white woman all matched the pattern, but the hair made this case different. Most companion children were photographed with their natural hair, sometimes styled to highlight how different they were from the white family members. Straightening a black child's hair like this would have been painful and rare at the time. It suggested the family wanted to remove visible signs of his race to make him appear more like a biological child. That was not just exploitation, it was an act of erasure. Eleanor began looking for more information about Adelaide Marsh. The name appeared in Richmond city directories from 1865 to 1882, listed at a substantial address in the Churchill neighborhood. Census records from 1870 showed the household included Adelaide Marsh, aged 32, listed as head of household, her widowed mother Margaret Marsh, age 58, and one servant, a black woman named Celia, age 45. There was no child recorded in the household at all. This was not unusual for the period. Black children living in white households were often deliberately left out of official records or listed in ways that obscured their real status. But the absence of any child in a census taken the same year as the photograph raised questions. If Samuel was Adelaide's son, legally or otherwise, why was he not counted among the household members? And if he was not her son, then who exactly was he? Eleanor dug further into the Marsh family history. She discovered that Adelaide's husband, a cotton merchant named Walter Marsh, had died in 1864, during the last year of the Civil War. His will, filed with the Richmond Probate Court, made provisions for his wife, and specifically mentioned all servants and their children currently held by the estate. The Marshes had been enslavers, and according to the will, those enslaved people had not been freed upon Walter's death, but transferred to Adelaide's ownership. Among the names in an inventory attached to the will was a woman named Celia, age 39 at the time, and her daughter, name not listed, age 4. There was no mention of a son. But 4 years later, the census showed Celia still in the household at age 45, with no daughter recorded, and the photograph showed a boy of about 6 or 7, dressed in velvet, leaning into Adelaide Marsh's shoulder as if she were his mother. Elena contacted Dr. Okonkwo again with her findings. The historian's response was careful but grim. "This fits a pattern I've seen in many cases. After emancipation, some white families kept black children even when the adults in their families left or were forced out. The children were young enough to be controlled. In some cases, the white family claimed legal guardianship through the apprenticeship system. But the most troubling cases are the ones where no legal mechanism was used at all. The white family simply kept the child, sometimes claiming them as orphans, sometimes presenting them as adopted, and sometimes, as this photograph suggests, trying to pass them off as biological children. Straightening the hair would fit that last category. It was an attempt to make the child's race less visible. Dr. Okonkwo explained the broader context that allowed such arrangements. In the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, Virginia and other former Confederate states passed laws known as the Black Codes, designed to limit the freedom of newly emancipated people and push them back into labor arrangements that differed from slavery in name only. One of the most insidious provisions let courts apprentice black children to white employers, often their former enslavers, if the children were deemed orphans, abandoned, or without adequate support. The definition of adequate support was left to white judges, who often ruled that black parents struggling to survive in the post-war economy were unfit to care for their children. But even this legal framework did not account for all the children who remained in white households. Some were kept through informal arrangements, verbal agreements, or simple coercion. A black mother working as a domestic might be told that if she wanted to keep her job, her child would have to stay in the household too. The child might be presented to visitors as a ward, a companion, or sometimes, as in the Marsh photograph, as something more ambiguous. Still, the practice was common enough that it had its own language: yard children, house children, pet children. Terms that made the arrangement sound harmless while hiding its underlying violence. The hair is what makes this case particularly disturbing. Dr. Okonkwo continued in a follow-up call. Hair straightening for black people in this era was rare and painful. The most common method used lye-based compounds that could cause serious burns if left on too long. For a 6 or 7-year-old to be subjected to this repeatedly to maintain straight hair would have been genuinely traumatic. It suggests the family was not just keeping the child as a companion or servant, but actively trying to change him. They were trying to erase his identity. Elena found herself returning to the photograph again and again, studying the boy's face for signs of what he might have been feeling at that moment. His expression was hard to read. The long exposure times of the era meant subjects had to hold still for several seconds, often resulting in blank or strained looks. But there was something in the set of his mouth, a tightness that might have been discomfort or something else entirely. She wondered if his scalp was still burning from the chemicals used to flatten his hair. She wondered if he understood why he was dressed in velvet and posed beside this woman. She wondered if he remembered his mother and whether she had any choice in letting him go. The next step required a visit to Richmond, to the church where the Marsh family had been members. Eleanor made the trip in early summer, driving down from her office in the Shenandoah Valley to meet with the archivist at St. Paul's Episcopal Church, one of the oldest and wealthiest congregations in the city. The church stood prominently on Gray Street, its white steeple visible for blocks. During the Civil War, Jefferson Davis himself had worshipped there, and the pews still had small brass plaques marking the families who had purchased them generations ago. The Marsh name appeared on one of these plaques in the third row from the front. The church had kept meticulous records of births, deaths, marriages, and baptisms going back to the 18th century. These records served a dual purpose in the antebellum era. They documented the spiritual lives of white congregants, but also sometimes noted the baptisms of enslaved people owned by church members. These entries were brief and often lacked surnames, recording only a first name, the owner's name, and the date. In their way, they were property records disguised as religious documents. If Samuel had been baptized there, or if any official record of his connection to Adelaide Marsh existed, it would be in those ledgers. The archivist, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Dorothy Hale, was initially skeptical of Eleanor's questions. The Marsh family were generous donors of this church for generations, she said, leading Eleanor down a corridor lined with portraits of former rectors. I'm not sure what you expect to find that would be historically significant. But when Eleanor showed her the photograph, Mrs. Hale's expression shifted. She studied it for a long moment, then looked up at Eleanor with something that might have been recognition. "I've seen this boy before," she said quietly. "Not in person, obviously, but there's another photograph in the collection." The second photograph, which Mrs. Hale retrieved from a storage room in the church basement, showed the same boy about 10 years older. He was dressed in the plain dark suit of a household servant, standing behind a seated group of white women at what seemed to be a church event. The women were smiling, fanning themselves against what must have been summer heat, their dresses light, colored, and their expressions relaxed. Behind them, Samuel stood rigidly. His hair was short now, natural, tight curls visible even in the faded image. He was not looking at the camera. He was looking down at the floor, his hands clasped in front of him in a posture of stiff stillness. Eleanor started searching for more details about Adelaide Marsh. The name appeared in Richmond city directories from 1865 to 1882, listed at a large and well-known address in the Church Hill neighborhood. Census records from 1870 showed the household included Adelaide Marsh, age 32, listed as the head of the home, her widowed mother Margaret Marsh, age 58, and one servant, a black woman named Celia, age 45. No child was listed in the household at all. This was not unusual for that time. Black children living in white homes were often purposely left out of official records or listed in vague ways that hid their true position. Still, the absence of any child in a census taken the same year as the photograph raised serious questions. If Samuel was Adelaide's son, legally or in any other way, why was he not counted as part of the household? And if he was not her son, then who was he really? Eleanor pushed deeper into the Marsh family history. She learned that Adelaide's husband, a cotton merchant named Walter Marsh, had died in 1864 during the final year of the Civil War. His will, filed with the Richmond Probate Court, made arrangements for his wife and clearly listed all servants and their children then held by the estate. The Marsh family had been enslavers, and according to the will, those enslaved people were not freed after Walter's death, but passed into Adelaide's control. In an inventory attached to the will, a woman named Celia was listed, age 39 at the time, along with her daughter, unnamed, age 4. There was no mention of a son. Yet 4 years later, the census still showed Celia in the household at age 45, with no daughter listed, and the photograph showed a boy around 6 or 7 years old, dressed in velvet, leaning into Adelaide Marsh's shoulder as if she were his mother. Eleanor contacted Dr. Okonkwo again and shared what she had found. The historian's reply was calm but deeply unsettling. She said this matched a pattern she had seen many times. After emancipation, some white families kept black children even after the adults in their families had left or been pushed out. The children were young enough to be controlled. In some situations, white families claimed legal guardianship through the apprenticeship system. But the most disturbing cases were those where no legal system was used at all. The white family simply kept the child. Sometimes they claimed the child was an orphan. Sometimes they said the child was adopted, and sometimes, as this photograph suggested, they tried to present the child as their own biological child. Straightening the boy's hair fit that last effort. It was a way to make his race less visible. Dr. Okonkwo then explained the larger system that allowed these situations to exist. After the Civil War, Virginia and other former Confederate states passed laws known as the Black Codes. These laws were meant to limit the freedom of newly freed people and push them back into labor arrangements that were slavery in all but name. One of the most harmful rules allowed courts to apprentice black children to white employers, often their former enslavers, if the children were judged to be orphans, abandoned, or without proper support. What counted as proper support was decided by white judges, who often ruled that black parents struggling in the broken post-war economy were unfit to raise their own children. Even so, this legal system did not explain every case. Many children stayed in white households through informal deals, spoken agreements, or simple pressure. A black mother working as a domestic servant might be told that if she wanted to keep her job, her child would have to remain in the household as well. The child might be introduced to visitors as a ward, a companion, or, as in the Marsh photograph, something deliberately unclear. The practice was common enough to have its own terms: yard children, house children, pet children. These words made the arrangement sound gentle while hiding the deep harm underneath. Dr. Okonkwo said the hair was what made this case especially disturbing. Hair straightening for black people during that time was rare and extremely painful. The most common methods used lye-based chemicals that could cause serious burns if left on the skin too long. For a child of 6 or 7 to go through this again and again to keep his hair straight would have been deeply traumatic. It suggested the family was not only keeping the child as a servant or companion, but actively trying to change who he was. They were trying to erase his identity. Eleanor found herself returning to the photograph over and over, studying the boy's face for clues about what he might have felt in that moment. His expression was hard to understand. Long exposure times meant people had to stay still for several seconds, often leaving faces blank or tense. Still, there was something in the tight line of his mouth that suggested discomfort, or perhaps something even heavier. She wondered if his scalp was still burning from the chemicals used to flatten his hair. She wondered if he understood why he was dressed in velvet and posed beside this woman. She wondered if he remembered his mother and whether his mother had any real choice in letting him go. The next step required a trip to Richmond, to the church where the Marsh family had been members. Eleanor traveled there in early summer, driving from her office in the Shenandoah Valley to meet the archivist at St. Paul's Episcopal Church, one of the city's oldest and wealthiest congregations. The church stood prominently on Grace Street, its white steeple visible from far away. During the Civil War, Jefferson Davis himself had worshipped there, and the pews still carried small brass plaques showing the names of families who had purchased them generations earlier. The Marsh name appeared on one of these plaques, in the third row from the front. The church had kept detailed records of births, deaths, marriages, and baptisms reaching back to the 18th century. In the antebellum period, these records served two purposes. They recorded the spiritual lives of white members, but they also sometimes noted the baptisms of enslaved people owned by those members. These entries were usually short and often lacked last names, listing only a first name, the owner's name, and a date. In effect, they were property records disguised as religious ones. If Samuel had been baptized there, or if any official note of his link to Adelaide Marsh existed, it would be found in those books. The archivist, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Dorothy Hale, was at first doubtful about Eleanor's questions. She said the Marsh family had been generous supporters of the church for generations, and led Eleanor down a hallway lined with portraits of former rectors. She said she was not sure what Eleanor expected to find that would matter historically, but when Eleanor showed her the photograph, Mrs. Hale's expression changed. She studied it quietly for a long moment, then looked up with something close to recognition. She said she had seen the boy before, not in person, but in another photograph in the collection. The second image, which she brought from a storage room in the church basement, showed the same boy about 10 years older. He wore a plain dark suit, the kind worn by household servants, and stood behind a seated group of white women at what appeared to be a church gathering. The women smiled and waved fans against the summer heat, their light dresses and relaxed faces showing comfort. Behind them, Samuel stood stiff and silent. His hair was short now, natural, with tight curls visible even in the faded photograph. He was not looking at the camera. He was looking down at the floor, his hands folded in front of him, his posture rigid and controlled. In the end, a compromise was reached. The photograph would be shown again with a new and expanded caption. This caption would clearly state that the true relationship between the two people in the image was uncertain, and would explain the practice of companion children in the post-Civil War South. A small exhibition would be built around the image, including both photographs and selected church records that documented Samuel's return to his mother. The Historical Society also agreed to search for descendants of Samuel and Celia, if any could be located, and invite them to take part in telling the full story. Finding those descendants took another 6 months. Eleanor worked closely with a genealogist named Marcus Webb, who specialized in tracing African American family histories. The work was slow and difficult, made harder by the deliberate destruction of records and the fact that black families were often separated and scattered. Webb explained that tracing a line like Samuel's meant working both backward and forward at the same time, using whatever fragments of evidence had survived. These included marriage licenses, death records, land deeds for the few families who managed to own property, school enrollment lists, church records from many congregations, and membership rolls from fraternal groups. Families often moved to follow work or escape violence, so the records were spread across many places. The search was made even more complex by the Great Migration, when millions of black Americans left the rural South for cities in the North and West during the early 20th century. People left places like Richmond in search of better pay, safer lives, and freedom from Jim Crow laws that controlled nearly every part of daily life. Their descendants could now be anywhere. Marcus Webb traced Samuel's son through census records to Baltimore in 1910, then to Philadelphia by 1920. After that, the trail became clearer. Samuel's granddaughter married a steelworker with the last name Holland. Their children stayed in Philadelphia. Eventually, Webb located a woman named Patricia Holland living in the Germantown neighborhood. She was a retired nurse. Her family Bible listed her great-great-grandmother Hannah and included a note about Hannah's husband Samuel. The entry read, "Born in bondage, taken as a child, and returned to his mother by the grace of God." Patricia Holland traveled to Richmond for the exhibition opening. She stood in front of the 1,870 photograph for a long time without speaking, her hand resting against the glass case as if she might reach through it and touch the boy inside. When she finally turned to Eleanor, tears were on her face, but she was smiling. She said her grandmother used to talk about him and called him the stolen son. She said he never spoke about those years, not to anyone, but that his mother Celia used to say the white woman dressed him like a doll and burned his hair to make him look like something he was not. The family had always thought it was just a story. They never knew there was a photograph. The exhibition ran for 4 months and attracted more visitors than any previous show at the Historical Society. Local newspapers covered the story, and several academic journals published articles about companion children, using the Marsh photograph as a key example. Dr. Okonkwo gave a lecture at the Society to a full auditorium. She explained how Samuel's story fit into a wider pattern of white families keeping control over black children, through both legal and illegal means after emancipation. She showed slides of other photographs identified by scholars as similar cases, images from Alabama, South Carolina, and Mississippi. All showed well-dressed black children posed beside white women who were not their mothers. The exhibition also led to a deeper examination within the Historical Society itself. Staff began reviewing other items in the collection that had been accepted decades earlier with little explanation or with misleading labels. They found photographs marked family servant that showed children far too young to be working. They found portraits described as nurse in charge where the so-called nurse was barely older than the baby she held. They found images of black people with no names at all, labeled only as domestic scene or household group. Each of these items was now being researched, given proper context, and, when possible, connected to descendants who could add their own histories. Richard Townsend, the director who had first worried about donor reactions, told Eleanor that the exhibition had changed how he understood the Society's mission. He said they had been treating photographs as objects to preserve and display, but not as evidence. For more than a century, they had presented that evidence in a way that supported one version of history while silencing another. He said he did not know how to fix everything that had been done, but they had to begin somewhere. For Elena, the most meaningful moment came near the end of the exhibition, when Patricia Holland returned with her daughter and 2 grandchildren. They stood together in front of the photograph, 4 generations of Samuel's descendants, looking at the image of a boy who had been taken, erased, and later reclaimed. The youngest child, a girl about 7 years old, the same age Samuel had been when the photo was taken, pointed at the picture and asked her great-great-grandmother who the people were. Patricia knelt beside her and said the boy was her great-great-great-grandmother's son. His name was Samuel, and the woman next to him was not his mother. His real mother was Celia, who loved him so much that she spent years fighting to get him back, and she did get him back. The girl looked again at the photograph and then asked why his hair looked like that. Patricia was quiet for a moment. She said they were trying to make him into something he was not, but it did not work. He always knew who he was, and now they knew too. Photographs lie. This is not a new idea, but it needs to be repeated every time we look at an old image and assume we understand it. A camera captures a moment, But that moment is always arranged, always framed, always a performance of what the subjects and the photographer want us to believe. A white woman in silk with a black child in velvet, a small body leaning into what appears to be a loving embrace. These images suggest love, family, and belonging. But the details tell another story. The burned hairline, the missing census record, the separate ledger for special commissions, the church note marking a return that should never have been needed. Samuel's photograph is not unique. Archives, attics, and museum storage rooms across the country hold thousands like it. Portraits meant to show kindness and care, but that actually record something much darker. Children dressed as companions and displayed as proof of a slaveholder's goodness. Families posed together to hide the violence that held them in place. Hair burned straight, skin lightened. Identities erased to keep the lie that everything was normal and good. Every one of these photographs is a crime scene, and every one is also a record, if we learn how to read it, of people who survived. Samuel survived, Celia survived, their descendants survived, carrying the story forward even when the photograph tried to erase it. The next time you look at an old portrait and feel a warm connection to the past, look closer. Look at the hands, the hair, the edges of the frame. Look for what does not belong. Look for the story the image is trying not to tell, because that story belongs to someone, and they have been waiting a very long time to be seen.